Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, January 31st, we will hear the presentation, The Practice and Principles of Form-Based Codes. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of sponsoring chapters and divisions. I would like to thank all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Maryland chapter. For more information on this chapter and how to become a member, visit marylandapa.org. To learn more about all our chapters, visit planning.org/chapters. To learn about our divisions, planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, visit utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM. Select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of distance education credits, check the webcast webpage again at utah-apa.org/webcasts. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on upcoming sessions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available at ohioplanning.org/webcast presentations. I'd now like to introduce our three speakers and get started today. Philip Dales is a land use attorney at Hyatt Weber in Annapolis, Maryland. His practice focuses on assisting clients with plan development applications, special exceptions, variances, rezoning, land use regulation, and comprehensive planning. He is a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law, where he earned his Juris Doctor, and the University of Virginia School of Architecture, where he earned a Master's in Urban Environmental Planning. He completed the Environmental Law program at the University of Maryland, focusing on land use law and interning with the Form-Based Code Institute. Prior to graduate school, Philip worked in the Brownfields office and the Office of Sustainable Facilities at U.S. EPA headquarters. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in English and Economics from Washington and Lee University. Geoffrey Ferrell is our second speaker. Jeff is one of the originators of the modern practice of form-based codes. His work ranges from site-specific urban designs to zoning toolkits to replace Euclidean zones, development regulations that emphasize clarity for end users. Before establishing his firm in 1992, Jeff was an urban designer and code writer in Miami and served 2 years as the Director of Urban Design for the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council in Florida. Jeff lectures extensively on form-based codes at state and national planning conferences, planning schools, and for the Form-Based Codes Institute. His work is featured in the books Form-Based Codes by Daniel and Karen Perolik and Paul Crawford, The New Urbanism by Peter Katz, and Retrofitting Suburbia by Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson. His experience with adapted municipal form-based codes goes back to 1991, including the Master Plan and Form-Based Code for the redevelopment of the Columbia Pike Corridor in Arlington, Virginia, and Metropolitan Dade County Traditional Neighborhood Ordinance. His firm's form-based codes for the Farmers Branch Texas Station area and for the Heart of Peoria Form Districts in Peoria, Illinois, received the Richard Dries Form-Based Code Award in 2007 and 2010. Jeff holds a Master of Architecture with a certificate in American Urbanism from the University of Virginia, a Bachelor of Architecture from Oregon School of Design, and a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy from Willamette University. He is a charter member of the Congress for New Urbanism and a charter board member for the Form-Based Codes Institute. Our final speaker is Jason Beske. Jason is a principal urban designer and planner for Arlington County, Virginia. Prior to this appointment, he was senior planner for the city of Overland Park, Kansas, and for the town of Leesburg, Virginia. He has worked to restore suburban communities and vital pedestrian places through the use of suitable site planning and urban design solutions, including form-based codes. As chair of the American Planning Association's Urban Design and Preservation Division, Jason has promoted the education of planners and allied professionals in the principles of urban design and the integration of design and urban planning. He frequently lectures on the topics of urban design and form-based codes at national and state APA conferences. Jason is a board member of the Form-Based Code Institute and holds bachelor's and master's degrees in community and regional planning from Iowa State University. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Philip.
Good afternoon. I'm Philip Dales, land use attorney at Hyatt Weber, PA in Annapolis, Maryland. Thank you, Christine, for that introduction. And thank you to the Maryland APA chapter for sponsoring this planning webcast. As Christine mentioned, I'm joined today by Geoff Ferrell of Ferrell Madden and Jason Anderson of Arlington County. We're here to talk about form-based codes. Specifically, we want to deliver some information about how form-based codes work, how they're developed and administered, and how they address problems of dysfunctional development in ways conventional zoning does not. To that end, our talk today intends to treat the subject of form-based codes in less of a conceptual manner than you may have encountered in other talks, and more of a practical manner. We want to help others understand how the rubber meets the road, or the street, as the case may be. But before we turn that corner and follow that practical line for the rest of the hour, I do want to lead off with one somewhat more ideological message. Many of you may be familiar with the wonderful 2008 guidebook, Form-Based Codes, by Karen and Daniel Perolik, as well as Paul Crawford. Find this quotation from the second foreword by Stefanos Palazoides to be quite persuasive, and I'd like to read it in full. The key difference between form-based codes and conventional zoning is the relegation of regulation by use to a position ancillary and secondary to form. That is as it should be. The evidence over the centuries is overwhelming that as economies evolve, the shell of the world's most desirable cities and their buildings remains relatively stable. It is the uses they accommodate that change continually. The disposable project is a passing aberration of the 20th century. The wealth of all nations is embodied more than in any other way in the constant investment, the lavishing of resources upon their permanent buildings and cities. Of course, the idea that our buildings and cities are so important to who we are as a people may be inherently compelling to those of us who devote our careers to the built environment. But there's something else about this quote that speaks to the practical draw of form-based codes. The shell of the world's most desirable cities and their buildings remains relatively stable. It's recognizing the desirability of that shell itself, the form, that helps elevate the importance of form in planning and zoning. What we're here to talk about today is just how to elevate the place of form in planning and zoning, how to make the case for primarily regulating form rather than use, and how to do it. That is, how to regulate form and administer a code that ensures predictable results for the built environment and well-functioning development. To tell us about that, we are very lucky to have with us today Geoff Ferrell, Ferrell Madden, and Jason Beske of Arlington County. As Christine said earlier, both Geoff and Jason have extensive experience in developing and administering codes. Both sit on the board of directors of the Form-Based Codes Institute. Geoff has developed codes that are in place today in multiple jurisdictions, including Overland Park, Kansas, Portsmouth, Virginia, Peoria, Illinois, Farmers Branch, Texas, and Arlington, Virginia. Several of those codes have won awards from APA and the Form-Based Codes Institute, and Jason has also been a part of the code development process in multiple jurisdictions and has had more than 10 years of experience administering form-based codes. In Arlington, where Jason is principal planner and urban designer, the Columbia Pike Neighborhoods Area Plan was recently adopted for the area surrounding the original Columbia Pike Code, and a new form-based code is planned as a means of implementing the plan. To say just a little about myself and our practice at Hyatt Weber in Annapolis, our land use team often provides advice to clients in the comprehensive planning and zoning process, or sometimes in the quasi-legislative processes like those sometimes involve plan development applications. As an attorney with a planning background, our work allows me to see the value of a form-based code from the perspective of property owner as well as the public interest. And while we don't have any form-based codes in place in the jurisdictions we frequently work in, I'm certainly hoping to promote form-based codes in cities and counties all over Maryland. Hopefully today's webcast will help spread the word. But to turn now to this afternoon's topic, I'll start by giving a little background to lay the foundation, and then I'll hand things over to Jeff to talk about the principles and mechanics of form-based codes before Jason wraps things up for us by discussing the development and administration of form-based code using 2 case studies. In recent years, the subject of form-based codes definitely seems to be receiving increased attention in publications by planning and architecture organizations and in conversation amongst practitioners. At least in part, that's likely because of an acceleration in the number of form-based codes being adopted around the country. One study, the code study by Hazel Boris and Emily Talon of Placemakers, puts the number of form-based codes now in place or in development at over 450. Some examples of cities where form-based codes have been adopted or are currently being developed are listed on this slide. The first group being cities over 400,000, the second over 200,000, and the third representing some smaller jurisdictions. You'll hear about some of these codes today, and some of you may already know something about others. In the first group, Miami, most of you will know, represents Miami 21, where there's already been over 10 million square feet of development under form-based code. And Denver represents both the Denver Zoning Code by Code Studio and the Denver Commons by Design Workshop, which won a Driehaus Award for the Form-Based Codes Institute. Incidentally, after the Denver Zoning Code was adopted, applications for zoning designation changes in Denver steadily fell from 55 projects in 2009 before the code was adopted to only 21 in 2012. Now, with regard to the second group of examples here, there's a very exciting code currently being developed in Buffalo, New York, and I would note, especially because of the affiliation between this webcast series and APA Ohio, that Cincinnati has now adopted 3 of the 4 codes developed for Cincinnati neighborhoods, with the 4th for the Westwood neighborhood going before the City Council in just over a week. In our last group, we see another Opticos code in Flagstaff, Arizona, and one in Ferrell Madden's zone in the heart of Peoria, which is also a Driehaus Award winner. You can find links to many of these from the Form-Based Codes Institute's website, as well as other sample codes from around the country. Just considering the examples in that previous slide, not to mention the far wider range of codes in the code study, form-based codes come in many different forms or varieties. And as we thought about our audience today, it seemed wise to me to begin by explaining some of the key ways in which individual codes differ. First, codes can be small in geographic scope or comprehensive. Second, they can be mandatory or optional, functioning as parallel alternative sets of rules to conventional zoning already in place. And third, codes are spatially organized in a variety of different ways. Now, for anyone out there attracted to the idea of a form-based code in their area, but unsure how exactly one would be applied, you might start by considering geographic scope, which geographic scope would make the most sense. Some codes are applied citywide or to an entire region. Miami 21 might be the most famous example of a citywide code, but a few other examples are the Denver Zoning Code and the Green Code in Buffalo. Other codes simply identify a specific small area, neighborhood, or corridor. Some apply only to a city's downtown and surrounding suburbs. Flagstaff's code in its current form is an example of a downtown code, and both Columbia, Pike, and Arlington, and the Metcalf corridor in Overland Park, Kansas, which is pictured here, are examples of corridor-focused codes. You could also develop an FBC to apply to multiple discontiguous districts, as in Cincinnati or Peoria, pictured here. Market timing, local politics, the state of current development, the property ownership circumstances, and the planning department resources available at the time might all affect which scale would be most appropriate in a given jurisdiction. The next characteristic of form-based codes that varies from code to code is the implementation strategy. In other words, how do the code's regulations interface with the existing zoning code? In some cases, form-based code is mandatory. It stands alone as a wholesale replacement for the prior zoning in the chosen geographic area. In other regulations, an FBC may be mandatory, but worked into the existing zoning code. That is, some of the pre-existing conventional code may remain in place, with the form-based code simply included to govern certain standards in a given area of the city. In other cases, form-based codes are implemented as an alternative to the existing conventional zoning code. In that case, the code functions in parallel to traditional zoning, so that a property owner may choose to pursue entitlement under either the conventional zoning standards or the regulations of the form-based code. And finally, codes are sometimes adopted as floating zones that could be applied in one or more geographic areas and could be implemented as mandatory or optional codes. The existing of the floating zone regulations in the municipal code would provide a jurisdiction with the choice to implement those form-based regulations in the future, presumably through legislative or possibly administrative action. Clearly, the choice a municipality makes for how it will implement a code has an effect on the way that the code governs development in the future, once it's in place. But in some cases, the implementation choice may also be very important to the political viability of adoption in the first place and workable administration going forward. The last basic characteristic of a code that I'll mention before passing the mic to the real experts is a code's organization. Sometimes referred to as the code's organizing principle, there are various ways in which a code may organize its form regulations. The transect, featured in DBZ's Smart Code, is one familiar organizing principle. The other codes are organized based on a network of street types, or more commonly now, street frontages. And others still are organized by neighborhoods or districts. But the common characteristic of form-based codes with regard to organization is that development standards are key to a map or plan based on spatial relationships of those form standards rather than relationships between uses, as is often the case in conventional zoning maps with only a de facto spatial element. With form-based codes, the desirability of certain form standards at a particular location on the regulating plan bears a logical relationship to that location in the context of the plan as a whole. No matter which type of organizing principle a jurisdiction applies, form-based codes essentially regulate the relative location of those chosen form standards. And that observation brings me to the last slide of this introduction. And these shared characteristics of form-based codes are derived from materials of Form-Based Codes Institute. And that is to say that they're not direct quotations of the Institute's material, but are instead a set of characteristics I've drawn from various sources from the Institute that provide guidance on the definitive elements of form-based codes and all their various embodiments. Generally speaking, codes focus primarily on regulating urban form and less on regulating permitted uses. Codes are regulations that actually govern development rather than design guidelines. Codes emphasize parameters for form with predictable physical outcomes like build-to lines and frontage type requirements rather than relying on numerical parameters like floor-to-area ratios or dwelling units per acre whose outcomes are impossible to predict. Codes shape the public space adjacent to development through building form standards, especially specific requirements for building placement, as well as standards for the public space itself. Codes promote or preserve an interconnected street network with pedestrian-scaled blocks. Code regulations and standards are key to specific locations on a regulating plan. Code diagrams are unambiguous, clearly labeled, and accurate in their presentation of spatial configurations. And though they exercise tighter control over elements of design, form-based codes provide administrative approval for applications that meet the code's requirements. And that last one is particularly attractive to many of our potential clients here at Hyatt Weber. It means greater predictability. And so with that last bit of summary, I hope I've set the stage for a practical discussion about how to put codes in place and effectively administer them. I'll now pass the baton to Mr. Geoffrey Ferrell.
All right, now with apologies, I'm going to delve into the conceptual. And to begin with, first really question is what's wrong with our current system? And there's some fundamental things. There's nothing wrong with our policy goals or our planning. We're not planning for awful places, but we tend to get them. And this is something put together by Steve Price, one of our colleagues. He was a planning commissioner at El Cerrito, California. So this architecture looks a little bit Californian and not appropriate to your location, just understand that. Here's a well-intentioned policy statement, which if you read it, it's really hard to disagree with, and I would suggest that the image down below is a good reification of this. You know, it looks like a nice place. You've got affordable housing that looks decent. It's a walkable place. This looks like a good place. But this is a Photoshopped image crafted by Steve. The underlying image that you'll see here in a second is what actually got built resulting from this well-intentioned policy statement. And there's an issue here about our policy goals versus the technical regulatory instruments we use. Now, I would suggest this is a pretty disappointing picture compared to the other one. You've got affordable housing, but it looks like you might not want to live there instead. Instead of canopy street trees, you've got landscaping that's really more like the North Woods, trying to buffer those dwelling units from that awful, I call it less a street than a transportation corridor. But you understand, you know that every little bit of that is highly regulated and specified by all the different silos of the kind of abstract technical expertise. There are 2 left-hand turn lanes there, and there's some set of numbers and principles that give it. If you look on the far left, that really wide curb radii that lets somebody making a right turn do it at about 30 miles an hour, that's specified. All of this stuff is here. So our regulatory instruments is kind of undoing our planning. Now, some people have tried to address these, I say, disappointments with different tools. Performance zoning or performance management is one. I think it's not a good idea for this to be the thing that you base your codes around, your planning around, but it does have a place. Now, at its bad form, you just get the kind of simplistic, the more different things are, the bigger the buffer. That's how you get the suburbs, which we know don't really work. And there are other aspects of it, different setback zones. There's a place for this kind of stuff in common sense coding, but of course we're suggesting that form be first. Any good form-based code is going to deal with things like noise, noxious fumes, etc., but it's form first. A critique, look at all those colors. There's no lack of planning going on in our world, but we're using the wrong tools. The basic idea of these zoning colors, here's red. This is commercial. A little bit of commercial heaven in Florida. This is also red on the map, though. So the same idea, the same concept, red equals commercial, and you can have different flavors of it, as you saw from the earlier images. We've got so many different colors that the eye starts to lose the ability to discern between them. But you have such fundamentally different human environments, it kind of suggests that we're using the wrong tool, and that being so heavily based on use is not a good idea if we want to have some notion of planning. And when we see this stuff laid out on the ground, we see there's a kind of a random, this is not making place, this is some kind of other factor. So what you end up with on the ground is a mess, like this. Floor area ratio is a great thing to beat up on. It gives you great statistical probability, but again, as a human space, you could get either at 1.0 something like brownstones or towers on a plinth of parking, completely different places. The problem is we kind of put the cart before the horse, and we're letting our statistics drive what we're doing. This is a picture of my business partner, Mary Madden, in front of Thomas Jefferson's house. And this is a little story about aesthetic design guidelines. People sometimes confuse form-based coding with earlier planning ideas about traditional urbanism. And there is a link, but too often there's this thought that if you make things look prettier, if you sort of decorate the building, that's what makes a good place. Well, in Albemarle County in Virginia, they had which is home to Monticello, they had a project on the edge of town that their local board of architectural review really beat up on, and I've told between 6 and a dozen times they sent the developer back to the drawing board and made him come back, and they basically made him decorate this building like it was Monticello. Columns became pilasters, the portico became a pediment, but they made it put in brick and white trim, but it's still a Toys R Us out on a big highway. So it's not decoration, it's not how it makes something look good, but really how it lives, how it functions. There are obviously more fundamental things that they weren't dealing with here. Suggestion that we're focusing on the wrong things in the same way that you don't push a string or a wet noodle. It's not logical. We're focusing on the wrong things. Here's an example of that big kind of tofu or butter pad of R40, whatever that means. Well, this is an example of that being built. Sometimes people literally build that. This is the Streeterville area in Chicago where some of these things got built. I point out as a somewhat of an aside, the citizens who came out to protest against these buildings after the fact, the thing they focused on was density. But we're going to look at a photo imaging job on this that retains all the density and even adds some and points to a different primary factor than density. This is a place that's more dense, but it's enlivening. It's making that street space a living public place. People live on it. You'll notice, if you look carefully, there's still, the parking is still there. There's some parking entrances, but it's buried inside the block. You have people living out on the street, and suddenly this area looks like a place where even those, you know, those people are photoshopped in, but it starts to look like it's a reasonable and understandable scenario. And notice in the background, the towers are still there. You just don't have those street-killing blank walls. Getting back to the fundamentals, there are reasons why we went to Euclidean zoning and got so hyper about separating our uses. We had some serious technical problems. Before 1908, but here's a shot of the Chicago River, could have been a number of American cities where we had dirty industries in our cities and in our neighborhoods, and there were real, literal health problems. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater. A suggestion that today development regulation has just gotten really out of balance. In any kind of regulation or planning of human settlements suggests that these are the three things that you fundamentally have to deal with. Form, something's going to get built, whether it's a street wall building in the Loop in Chicago or a Toys R Us just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. Something's going to get built and it's going to be physical. Use density, those things exist. Management, things like when you have on-street parking, when you don't, or what time the neighborhood bar has to turn off the music. Human elements. This is what's happening today. We're really hyper-controlling use and density, which makes management tougher. And we deal with form as something kind of thrown in at the end. It tends to be what I would call exterior decoration, like the Toys R Us. We try and make the building a little bit prettier. If you remember one conceptual slide from this whole webinar, remember this one. Form-based codes are not where you forget about use, but form is the primary thing. Use is still there. There's some places in planning where you're going to have some fairly specific use controls, but because it's form-based, there are a lot more places where you can be much less involved in regulating uses and let that small-scale market work. A hint that you can use the same terms to describe this street, mixed use, medium density, transportation corridor, that you can use to describe this street, I would say suggests that there's some not very much value in using those terms because, again, completely different human environments, but this is the kind of language we use in our planning and regulation. We need to look at something else. The idea of form versus use, the two interact. Here's a perfectly, I'd call it mediocre, or maybe give it a C+ townhouse street in a development outside of DC. And here in the very same development, the same kind of product. They're both townhouses, but because the form and function has a small switch to it. Here, the garages are in back, so you actually have people on the street. And I say this is kind of mediocre because, not that the buildings are bad, but that streetscape is non-existent. There are no trees, the sidewalk's too narrow. It could be better. So apples to apples, just putting the parking around the back, affecting the form in that simple way, makes a really different human environment. Now this is what you really want to have, where the quality goes up and the streetscape is good. This is a great human environment. But all three of those are townhouses at a certain level of density. But other things are involved. The wonderful use of parking. Everybody's got to have it. And I think in all of our lifetimes, we're going to need parking garages in cities. At some point, that'll go away, but I'm not worried about it. But you don't arrange parking out on the edge of a street like this because, as you know, and as this picture demonstrates, it just sucks the life off the street. Those two guys there look kind of creepy, maybe threatening if you're a woman walking home or kids. One of those people is me, and I'm not very creepy. But it's just an unhealthy situation. You have parking, but you handle it in other ways. You keep street life out at the sidewalk. You push the parking into the block interior. And here's an example. This is in, sorry, it's in Virginia, but this is Clarendon, near the Clarendon Metro Station. This is, they retained the street lights. This is a compromise. They didn't have a big enough block, or they didn't have the space to completely bury the parking structure, but they knew enough to not sacrifice the ground level. So they made what is functionally a mediocre parking structure, not very efficient, because the ground floor, most of it is taken up with shops. And then up above, you see on the second, third story, that's full parking. But this is a place where every weekend, probably thousands of people walk by this and don't realize they walked by a parking structure. At the same time, it's very well signed. Right around the corner, there's that neon sign that says park. What they've done is they made an intelligent compromise. This is a planning move. They kept the parking, which they needed for the space, but they kept the street space. They kept the activity of this really kind of a Main Street downtown area for this part of Arlington County. There's some fundamental lessons. This is a piece of Chicago where before people started moving back into Chicago, they were happy to get any kind of development. So here they got the leather collection. No problem with the business, but they did development in a suburban manner. What if they put that up to the street? By the way, look, they spent some money on public infrastructure, and I would suggest in this scenario in front of the parking lot, the benches, the flags, the trees, all that is really wasted, because you can tell even the bums would not, homeless people will avoid this area because it's so vacant. What if they put the parking in the back? And best case scenario would be small shops, but even if they had put the leather collection up front, you have a street space. This is a place that's more lively. One side actually works in synergy with the other side of the street, where in the prior slide it kind of sucked the life out of it. And suddenly those benches seem like a reasonable place to sit. A graphic explanation of what a form-based code is. Let's see this again. This is an as-is scene, or actually an as-was scene, because it's being reconstructed now. This is 2002. What if instead of focusing on use and density, you start to do a form-based code, which begins with establishing that line where you start the buildings, the line between public and private. We call it a build-to line. It's really creating and having a policy about where that public space is. Regulation is primarily about the building facade, because you're trying to create this public space in between. And here's a point about urban development being the ultimate public-private partnership. The public sector sets up the rules that development happens within, but without the private sector, all you've got is a set of rules. But if you set up those rules right, you get something built. It takes the private sector working within a smart set of rules to build the place that you plan for. No shortage of regulation today. We're just regulating the wrong thing. A form-based code, I would say, promises synergy because it's informing a master plan. What happens typically today, this is a real-world example on Sunset Drive, actually in, I think, Johnson City, Tennessee. The developer who built this is, because he's kind of acting on his own, he's building on an ugly road that damages his property. He doesn't know what the new development across the street might look like. So what he's done is he's turned his buildings rear into the street, and he's built his own street. So when the realtors drive prospects up on their street, he's controlling his environment completely. He doesn't have to deal with, he can pretend that Sunset Drive doesn't exist. The developer as isolated cowboy. But what if we had a master plan that didn't let that happen because it coordinated development, didn't allow people to turn their back to the street and build a big wall on it, but the developer can build here knowing that what happens across the street is going to be similar and not damage his property. You save him a lot of money because he doesn't have to build a street, so maybe he can do a fence and some plantings. At this case, and you can imagine similar development happening across the street, you start to get synergy. The developer is actually gaining from a positive public realm, and he's contributing to it, as opposed to what happens all too often today, where the more you build, the worse it gets. And by the way, in that prior selection, something still has to happen to make Sunset Drive less of a traffic sewer and more of, maybe if it's high traffic, a boulevard or an avenue. So it's, all things are public and private have to work together. A point we can't make too much, a form-based code has to be matched to a community agreed upon master plan. You can't just slap down a form-based code that people haven't talked about and agreed upon, because it's all about creating a public realm. So to talk a little bit about the charrette experience, I would say you've all done a lot of public planning. I'm going to talk about some things that are a little bit different. We're not the National Charrette Institute, but we always end up talking about that process a little bit. Not an absolute necessity, but by far the rule is that the good plans are done based on public input. Notice something here. These are citizens who are not sitting in an audience yelling up abstract things like, I'd like an aquarium or more parks, to a guy at the front room who's scribbling on newsprint. These are citizens who are actually drawing on top of a specific site where they have to deal with holistically problems and solutions. They have to deal with existing buildings, where there's parking, where the parks are. They don't just get to yell things out. So you're actually putting the onus on the citizens, and it's quite remarkable the responsibility that they take. We've done this a lot. This is some examples from a project we did a couple of years back in Marquette, Michigan, up in the UP, citizens dealing with what to do with their waterfront. Very important that citizens work together in groups and talk to each other, work it out. You see the citizens doing just that. Listening to one another, and they always find out they have an awful lot of things in common. And the drawings you get are things like these. You can say this is an ugly drawing, but in terms of the information that these drawings have en masse, they're beautiful drawings. There's information here. It's positive. People are having to come up with solutions, deal with things. And I would add, very importantly, there's still the role of the expert in here. Someone takes these concepts and starts to knit them together. And by the way, very typically, because people tend to all want good things, you get big ideas for what people want, things that are very much like this. Now it's the planners and the designers' job to take these ideas and start to knit them together in a whole policy. So you have planners, you have urban designers taking those ideas, making them into a coherent master plan and codes. A quick point, a form-based code doesn't do everything. It's a very important tool for implementation. Okay, from the point of view of private sector, this is what a citizen might see after you've adopted one of these plans. If they wanted to know what they could do with their property or property across the street, we call it 3 easy pieces. First is the regulating plan, something absolutely site-specific. This is the plan actually is done in Prince George's County, Maryland. The street on the bottom going left to right is Center Street, which runs into, becomes East Capitol. So if you drive to the left, you'll end up running into the U.S. Capitol and maybe John Boehner or Barack Obama. Absolutely, this is based on a vision plan. This is one of the more technical looking vision plans. But this was developed with a lot of public process. And I'm going to dive into this regulating plan and talk about what the different lines on it means. There are a lot of lines on it. There's a key. Sometimes these are simple. This is one of the more complex ones. But it's absolutely site-specific, absolutely planned. And we're going to zoom into this area, which is looking at a block that fronts onto Central Avenue and new back streets. A lot of lines and colors on this. The first line you're going to see is that required build-to line. See that in different places. That essentially says if you're going to walk down the sidewalk or walk down this street, when you get to this point, you're going to be running into a building. Most of that line is going to be occupied by the front of a building. The second line is what we call the parking setback line. It means when you walk down one of those streets, you will not be walking by an open parking lot. Any parking that, unless it's underground, has to be set behind that line, and that line can be varied. Typically, we do it at about 30 feet. So what's happening is here with these required build-to lines, we're setting up the public space of the street in between. Where these colors are is showing that's the public space. The white areas, that's the private space. That's where the private sector owns and develops within it. Those colors lead you to the building envelope standards, which are the set of rules for the building, form and function in the third dimension. Here you see the regulating plan of those colors. In this case, the lot we're looking at has both that red storefront and the kind of melon general frontage. In the building envelope standards, you're led to a series of diagrams and simple text that talks about height, siding, building elements, and use. Here we're talking about the basics, and when we talk about building elements, one thing that's very important, things like windows, balconies, and doors, you can imagine buildings without these, or maybe you can't. It should not be about the style of the building, as you see on the right, but it's really about function. Because when somebody builds, it may seem like a silly thing to require someone to have windows on the street, but you know, we know that people build those things without them, and when somebody builds a blank wall on a public street, it kills the street. So those should be regulated specifically. And a clear point here, we're talking about regulating the facade, the front of the building. We're not really dealing with what happens on the private side so much, but it's the facade where the private building meets the public street, where the regulation is concentrated. Architectural standards, sometimes referred to as the dress code, although if you include things like requiring transparent glass as opposed to mirrored or solid glass, that's more functional. But it's really how the building is closed. Windows and doors, this is where it tends to have the most regulation on it. Very different for commercial versus private buildings, residential, so it tends to have the most rules. Here's a kind of a graphic explanation of what architectural controls do, and really it based what a form-based code does. This was a redevelopment site, obviously pretty awful street space, and after the charrette proposed, the idea behind a form-based code enable development and coordinate developments as different developers come in, so it all fits together like pieces of a puzzle. Be transit ready and walkable where it comes in. And then here's the question of architectural control. What's the public policy interest in controlling? How much control of that building makes sense to make it look like that versus like that? And the answer varies with location. If you're in a historical district, perhaps it's more. But generally, we'd suggest it's really more about how it lives than how it looks. So don't be concerned with limits on aesthetic controls that might be embedded in your enabling regulations. Form-based coding is not so much about making things look a certain way as it is making them function a certain way. And by the way, here's that building in about 2008 and 2010. So this is the real building that got built. And now I think we're going to switch it over to Jason Beske. Very last point, though, this is not new stuff. We found in our workaround that form-based codes, what we're calling form-based codes, are almost harkening back to something that we did a long time ago. The dark paper you see in the middle of this is a piece of the 1903 Chicago Building Code. and it dealt with something like 4 form districts and 4 use types. So it's a little bit of going back to common sense and being simple. And keep in mind about transportation, the incredible role in sustainability. If you get a walkable environment right, it also, which by the way is also a mass transit friendly environment, that's the biggest chunk of sustainability you can do. Jason?
All right, thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to take the conversation a little bit further and start diving into some of the practical elements of the form-based code and the adoption of the code and the administration of the code. And I'm going to use 2 specific examples. The first is going to be Overland Park, Kansas, where I worked to help implement a mandatory code for the downtown of Overland Park. And if anybody knows Overland Park, it's known as a fairly progressive community in regards to planning in the Midwest. One of the issues that the city has, however, is that it was built up around a very efficient grid of thoroughfares that are spaced 1 mile apart. And the community, probably 6 to 8 years ago, started a process to really envision what could the future of one of these main corridors that traverse the county from north to south, what could the future of that corridor be, and in moving towards walkable urbanism and a different style of development that the community was not accustomed to. So I want to emphasize the importance that Jeff had mentioned, and actually Philip mentioned it earlier on, that having master plan guidance to support your efforts in the development of a zoning tool and the form-based code is really helpful and can be key to the success and adoption of a code. So in the case of Overland Park, Kansas, the Vision Metcalf plan was adopted in 2007, which looked at this 9.5 mile portion of this corridor, the Metcalf corridor, that you can see on the right slide, and it laid out the geographies by sub-areas and common characteristics. And the corridor itself on the northern part touches the inner portions of Kansas City. So those northern portions really end up being inner ring suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. And as you go south to the southern part of the corridor, you start to see some 60s, 70s, and 80s strip development. So there's a whole array of varying development throughout this corridor. The community early on decided that we would pursue developing a form-based code in one of those sub-areas. You can see it circled there, and that happens to be downtown Overland Park. The public participation was key in what we wanted to do, and there's no specific formula for any one community, but being able to reach out and discuss with and get input from varying stakeholders and advocates was key to the success there. So what we ended up doing was really culling the input of all these ideas, and what that helped us do furthermore was to determine the limits and tolerances of the work that we'd be able to develop this form-based code within, and then which geography of the implementation was going to work the easiest. The Vision Metcalf plan, I mentioned the importance of having that guidance. This was one thing it did do within the objectives of the plan was establish the idea that some type of a zoning tool would be developed, and more specifically in this case it would be a form-based code to begin to implement the ideas of the Vision Metcalf plan. And if one was to look at that, if you just search Vision Metcalf and Overland Park on the web, you could take a look at that, and this master plan was probably more form-based than any I've dealt with. And you really don't need to go to the length, I believe, of what this plan was, but it really did help to the people of Overland Park start to think differently and change the really a paradigm shift in the way they began to look at their community in this particular corridor. So the Vision Metcalf plan, the principle and guidance of this plan was taken into the development. It's not necessary to have these specific objectives, but it did help to capture the buy-in for future initiatives such as the downtown form-based code. This is downtown. You can see all the colored zoning districts, 19 different zoning districts, including 6 separate downtown zoning districts. And when we had to do a public notice for adoption of the form-based code, we put out dozens of signs and ended up having to submit a legal description for the property of the downtown, which was over 6 pages in a Word document, and we had to publish that in a newspaper, which is pretty interesting and make a good wallpaper someday. So the guiding principles that we wanted to get towards within the form-based code are indicative of all form-based codes, I believe, and that's the walkable urbanism, creating nice public realms where buildings relate to one another, relegating parking to a secondary role to the public realms, and making sure that we had a scale that was indicative of what the community wanted to see in our development. And you can see here, at the center of this image is a farmer's market pavilion, which really kind of became the centerpiece of the development of this form-based code. There was some historic fabric there, but this code really built on that, and there's really a foodie niche that has developed in downtown Overland Park that we envision the form-based code embracing and bolstering as we move forward. This is the regulating plan that developed out of the form-based code, and it looks very similar to what Jeff was showing you on the regulating plan. You have your colors. It's a street-based plan. You can see the green spaces, and I'll dive into these in a little bit to talk about how we didn't just take a generic form-based code and plop it down in downtown Overland Park. There were very specific conditions that we wanted to address as we developed the code. One of the issues we had early on was convincing some of the community that there's a big geographic area really to bite off if we want to have a form-based code. We'd never done this before. We didn't know what would be the tolerances were. But if you look at this map of Overland Park, it's over 75 square miles. And you can see to the top portion of the map is the regulating plan superimposed on the downtown area. And what that shows is it was really a relatively small area to try to implement to begin. And to get buy-in, we tried to convey that it should be easier to do something that's smaller than bigger to begin with. So, and this really represents 1/150th of the community. A very small area, a few hundred acres. All right, this is, I'm not going to dwell on this. This is the table of contents of our code, pretty typical for what you see. The approval process that Jeff mentioned was very important, and I don't know that 100% of form-based codes have administrative approval allowances, but that was one of the key pieces we as staff wanted to promote as we moved this through our Planning Commission and the City Council as to the importance and the predictability, as Philip mentioned, to developers as they were to come into downtown and begin developing to the code, which again is pretty esoteric to them. A lot of the development of the form-based code of a particular plan happens in a pre-planning process. I would say before, and I'll get into this in a little bit in Arlington, but is to really work on some of those issues early on before an application is even submitted. So that in that regard, it's very important to have staff who's really is well versed in form-based codes, and Overland Park was very supportive of their staff and in training for the administration of form-based codes. So that's one thing to consider is making sure that when you have planners that are going to be administering the codes, that they are well versed and understand the components of the code. So according to the schedule, a perfectly submitted plan could potentially be approved administratively within 2 months. And however, we know that no plan is perfect, but this is just an example of the steps we wanted to take to make it predictable and efficient for future development. One of the issues we had going through our public hearings is that there was an idea that if a code was developed and there was all administrative approvals, that if there were issues in that development and perhaps the community or the council or planning commission were not pleased with those issues, that there is an ability to have an appeal. And this likely would come from the developer who, in working with staff, did not support staff's position on a particular element of the code. So once a certificate of conformity is issued by staff, and if that certificate has conditions to it that the developer is not keen to, they do have the ability to appeal that decision to the Planning Commission. And once more, that Planning Commission decision could be appealed to the City Council. So there is some recourse for the development community in the development of the form-based code project. We dealt a lot with nonconformities, and I typically don't like to put words in my slides, a lot of words, and this one is very important though, and it's a good example. And I typically don't like to put green square bullets when I read text either, so we're having some font issues. But this is some good, this had a lot of thought put into it, and it gives us a couple different thresholds. One, the first bullet really talks to the fact that single-family or duplex structures in that downtown of Overland Park were quite sacred, and that nobody wanted to be able to regulate nonconformities in that realm. But if you were, for example, a commercial property or a multifamily property in that area, there are three thresholds for nonconforming buildings. So that if you wanted to come in and add on to a building, for example, if you wanted to add 10% of the square footage to an existing building, you can do that and only have to abide by the architectural standards of the code. If you want to add between 10 and 50% of the square footage of an existing building, you then have to comply not only to the architectural standards, but to the site design standards. And then finally, if you're adding greater than 50% of the square footage or exceeding 75% of the appraised value, which is in Johnson County in this example, that you would have to completely comply to the regulations of the form-based code. Non-conforming uses again. We did allow some nonconformities to be extended through buildings so that if they were made nonconforming by the form-based code, those uses could be continued. And that, however, we did limit it that you could not extend it to additional buildings or future buildings built on that same site. One lesson we learned through the process in Overland Park, and the top text isn't reading, but these black boxes represent historic structures in downtown Overland Park. And going through the public hearing process, one particular historic advocate in the community tried to attempt to preserve these historic buildings through the form-based code, and that you would code to not allow certain development in these buildings. We did not care for that approach. We felt that that was best kept in the designation of, at the state, the local, state, and national level. So that was one of the issues we ran into, but historic structures are something that many communities will run into when developing a form-based code. So just quickly, this is, again, the regulating plan, and this is the key to that plan. Jeff showed one that was a little more complicated. We kept it a little simpler where we were able to do that. And I will just dive into one of these areas and show that this orange, which we call the general urban area, was our most dense building envelope standard, which is on the right side is the building envelope standard that matches up with the color on the regulating plan. One thing we felt that worked out really well when developing the code was showing pictures to people of what these different densities or the different building typologies could look like, and that helped people digest the whole concept of the form-based code. So this is the building envelope standard. You can see on the bottom right there's a darker red. Probably can't read it, but we did have areas within the form-based code. You can see the darker orange on top of the regulating plan there on 80th Street, where we did require ground floor commerce or retail to exist in certain areas so that you can create a certain public realm that you're shooting for. So there are these little controls that you can dial up and dial down as you develop the regulating plan that get you towards the vision you're trying to establish. This is the lower end of that density range for or height range for that orange. This is the upper end. So we had some known heights and something we could tie it to. We also had the townhome or townhouse and small apartment frontage around the fringe of the downtown. This is what we were expecting to see. This is actually a project in downtown Overland Park that gained quick favor and was built before the code. And then finally, actually not finally, but there's two here. You can see the yellow, which is detached frontage, single family. We did not require or mandate that the form-based code be met on single family, but we did give an aspirational standard for those redeveloping single-family homes to develop towards. And then we had a very special condition in a portion of the downtown. You can see the gray on the right side there, which was a light industrial type development, which we wanted to bolster as a live-work type situation. And that was just one small block. We had street sections. We had signage controls and architectural controls, or have. Parking, again, a lot of the text isn't coming through, but just to say quickly that we wanted to really limit surface parking, and we developed relatively aggressive ratios in the core of our downtown to do that. This is the first time that we actually required or allowed a maximum amount of parking spaces, and we kind of had a range that we required in this downtown core. Again, this is the image in those, you can see on several of these buildings where there are parking structures internal, that's implementing that parking setback line, that blue line that Jeff mentioned, the Texas donut concept where you do the residential or retail commercial development around the parking and hide that. Uses, again, we did regulate use to a degree. We took we actually married this use table up to the existing zoning ordinance. And since we had uses spelled out in the zoning ordinance, we just made a tie to what was there. But we did play around a little bit with the permitted uses versus additional regulations. There's a few more pages that go to this that talk about very specific situations as far as what can happen at the ground floor versus upper floors and what type of a regulation may apply that would be special. But this table here really boils down a lot of text into one little area you can look at and help you understand what can be used and what's pursued. Quickly, I'm going to go through a couple of areas of implementation, and just to show how when you develop a regulating plan in the form-based code, you can really develop specific place-based interventions through the future development. So on the right side, you see a main thoroughfare. This is that Metcalf thoroughfare on the right side, and my cursor's going over here. And so the downtown here ties to that. This is the Farmers Market Pavilion, the green pavilion in the square. So what we wanted to do, this is looking west, you can see the green pavilion at the top, is develop a grid of streets to open up this downtown area to that Metcalf corridor more, which you see on the bottom of the picture. So creating this connection and relationship between the downtown and that corridor. And there, again, you can see close up what that corridor pavilion is and how that would tie to Metcalf. You can see the street at the upper right tying. This is a visualization by Steve Price that was put together during the Shred. You can see just beyond this red car, there's the little clock tower in the downtown. And we felt that was a significant piece to open up to and start to create a development opportunity to tie to that corridor in the densities that we are envisioning. And bus rapid transit is being developed that would tie into downtown Kansas City and parts south and Overland Park, which was going to make this transit-ready development. Here's just some renderings that came out of the charrette. You can see the tie, the interconnectedness. These are two specific examples where we tweaked the form-based code to accommodate local conditions. This red here on the left, which translates to the orange on the regulating plan. If you see the text on the regulating plan, the general 1 to 4, what that meant is we had a very auto-oriented corridor, our portion of the corridor right there, and the community really wanted to maintain some of those services and auto-related businesses. But in the orange, we generally regulated a minimum of 2 stories, so you can develop certain densities in public realm. But we felt it was important in this area to allow only 1 story, and that's what we ended up doing for that orange to accommodate some of those auto-oriented businesses. The blue represents a lot of homes and single-family homes as you go into the fringe of the single-family from downtown that have been converted to live-work units, and we wanted to maintain that option. So in the blue, you can see the townhouse live-work option, and we have some text that supports that within the form-based code itself, what those special standards may be. This is another area of the regulating plan, and if you zoom in, you can see one of the historic structures in the downtown is grayed out there. That's a theater. We wanted to create a colonnade in this downtown on 80th Street, the LA of trees. You can see the red line steps back to respect the facade of this building and create somewhat of a floor plaza on this building. And what that would look like in transformation that we've done is a public realm that becomes more and more inviting as the development occurs. Now I'm going to move into Arlington, which is where we are right now, and talk about a optional form-based code. And I would say Arlington's form-based code on Columbia Pike has probably been the most successful in the country with the most built results to date. And I will try to save some pictures for the end here. But if you don't know, Arlington County is the piece of Washington, D.C. that was taken back by Virginia just across the Potomac River. And there's a relationship to the downtown, but we have our own identity as well. If you're familiar with the area, there's Metro Rail that runs through the Roslyn-Boston corridor. It's the orange line with multiple stops. and you have the blue line running south through the Jefferson-Davis corridor. Columbia Pike is this red dotted outline, which is very similar to the auto-oriented corridors that we've looked at today. This is Arlington today on that RB corridor, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, and I'm going to be missing a lot of text on this one, but just to sum up this slide, it shows that initiatives on Columbia Pike have been ongoing for well over a decade, and that to establish the basis of the future development, there has been a succession of plans to build upon the earliest visions. And this shows these key nodes that we have been implementing over the last decade or so with a lot of built results. This is what the corridor looks like. Very close to Washington, D.C. Downtown is becoming more and more attractive as development or a lot of development is occurring out of the town. There's a lot of internal walkable urbanism opportunities close to downtown D.C. We are implementing a streetcar network along this line and planning that right now. And you can see this is on the top, you can see the Pentagon on the right side. So this is a 3.5-mile corridor that extends west from the Pentagon. And you have these key nodes that we have the illustrative plans for that came out of the charrettes. On the bottom, you can see a plan that represents filling in around those nodes from a more recent neighborhood form-based code plan that has been adopted here. So why would you do an optional form-based code? Well, there's several reasons, but probably the most prominent of all is that politically it's easier to adopt a form-based code and not mandate a requirement on developers early on, especially if you're one of the early founders of a form-based code movement in an area. And there's some legal reasons that I won't get into, but Virginia is a Dillon's rule state versus a home rule state, and some of the planning powers make it a little difficult to do that. This is just to show that what we ended up doing was allowing form-based code development in the zoning ordinance, and that you could apply form-based code, the new CP-FBC district, to all of these other zoning districts that exist in the Columbia Pike area. This is the table of contents, very similar to all the others, and we had some of the early basically stickman drawings of our building envelope standards, which have come a little ways. This is done by Jeff, by the way, but this is when it was little Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and again, so in Arlington, we have an administrative review process that does allow for a 30-day administrative review for sites less than 40,000 square feet, which I believe we've done only one to date. Most of them are larger than that, and it's a 55-day review. And what happens is that a lot of that work before an actual submittal happens with staff and through a staff checklist that we go through. And once staff has worked with the developer to really iron out the issues, you get in, and then you go through an advisory working group meeting, which is a subcommittee in our county that looks at just form-based code issues. Once you get past that process and you submit your application, you should be going to the Planning Commission and County Board within 60 days. Again, other issues do pop up, but we do allow modifications within our form-based code. It's probably not as generous as other form-based codes, but these are some of the reasons you can modify your plan, topography being the most recent that I've used in the review of a project. This is just a page of the checklist that we use as staff. As staff, we have over a 300-item checklist that comes basically right out of the code. And the urban designer in charge or the planner in charge of reviewing a project will give portions of this checklist to the relevant staff. For example, if it's a checklist related to transportation issues, a transportation planner would review that. And then we just call all of that input, provide it to the developer, advisory working group, Planning Commission, and County Board as we move forward. So it's a very extensive checklist. It takes a lot of time, but if you're following the checklist, this should get you to an approved project sooner than later. So an optional or parallel code may make sense if you have political will or the political will isn't there. It would make sense if you have development pressure, and it would also make sense to have an optional code if there's such an atmosphere in your community that you could not require or mandate certain types of development. So these are projects that have been approved. We have over a dozen projects, over hundreds of thousands of square feet of retail, 1,500 residential units through the form-based code, and growing. And these are some examples of what you see. You saw some of these with Jeff, but you can get a sense of where the corridor is going through a lot of hard work, staff working internally as well as with our community partners to get towards the vision. You can see Columbia Pike in 2002 when things really kicked off on top. We started with some lipstick on the pig changes with the streetscape, burying utilities, having nice streetscape elements, and then you start to plug in the buildings, and it goes a long way. This particular picture is one block off of the Pike, Columbia Pike, and you can see how these buildings start to address the neighborhoods and how that good development can really trickle into the back areas off of the Pike. And this is the last example I'll show, and this were a couple of historic facades that we did the facadectomy with this Halstead project you can see at the top there, where we maintained the facades and brought in a nice project. But so with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you for listening.
Okay, wonderful. We have a lot of questions, and not too much time, but we have about 15 minutes, so we'll see how many we can get through. Okay, the first one, please address the issue of parking requirements in form-based codes. In Denver, our FBC has reduced parking requirements for former zoning. However, development is occurring in areas with very limited public transit. Apartments are a particular problem when run into several adults, each with a car.
Well, there's no easy answer, but I guess this is one of those questions where you get posed with something that's a difficult transition. The parking problem certainly helps when you're in an area that has good transit. It's a little bit chicken or egg. When you start making places like this that support transit, you start getting better transit. I did some of my growing up in Denver, and I know there's a little bit of a spread problem there. So there's no magic bullet for that, but by building these places where you start to have the density and the mix of uses, that's when you start to support transit as well as reduce the compulsion to travel. And I would also add, and this is getting, I'm reaching here a little bit, but there's a little bit of an adjustment that people make as they move into these environments. It's a little bit hard to imagine not needing your car or needing your car less. And so when people first move into these environments, there is definitely a tendency to take their car or both their cars with them. So there will be some tendency for the people and the place both to slowly outgrow this. But unavoidable, there will be, you might call them teething problems as we grow into this.
Great.
Next question.
Okay. Many potential redevelopment sites have existing structures that need to be raised in order to apply form-based code ideals. Often this cost and regulatory constraints results in a development gap, which makes it nearly impossible for a developer to initiate a project. What has been your experience in bridging this development gap to allow for the successful redevelopment to form-based code standards?
I'll just say quickly and then let Jeff dive in, but we haven't seen that as a deterrent. Typically, a form-based code, take Arlington here for example, will allow a much greater return on an investment due to higher densities or units, and part of the the cost of raising buildings is sort of built in with the developer. It'd be interesting to hear a developer perspective of how that works into their pro forma, but in communities where we've administered projects, it has not been a hindrance that I've seen.
Yeah, this is Jeff. There was, in the most recent project for Columbia Pike we worked on, which involved the surrounding neighborhoods, there was a lot of work with our economic consultant, and we were talking about the idea of, it's really, I think, less the raising of the building, and I know you know this, but the kind of loss of cash flow. If you've got a building that has some kind of cash flow in it today, you're gonna cut that off for a certain amount of time. So there's a need, and in this area last year the discussions were, I think in unit terms, I think it was you started to break even at 3 new units per 1 old unit, something like that. Oh, but as Jason mentioned, when you're going to an urban kind of land use, I mean, the logic of the city is to use land intensely. So you're in the catbird seat when you're talking about giving a landowner a lot more value, ability to get a lot more value out of the same amount of land. So I don't know the specific situation. It may be that there's, if you have the new development set at too low a level, it's possible. I can imagine where there's a case where no, it does not pencil out to tear down the old building and build a new one.
And I'll just throw in too that in the Vision Metcalf plan, that 3-to-1 ratio that Jeff had mentioned was in there explicitly as an assurance to potential investors or owners. Next question.
Some of the form-based codes appear to require the developer to install certain improvements in the public right-of-way, such as canopied street trees and tree pits. These are exactions. What problems does this present in terms of the Nolan rationale nexus, Dolan rough proportionality, and Kuntz monetary exactions? What kind of study would be necessary to establish the relation between the requirements and these various requirements?
Okay. Well, unfortunately, our attorney had to jump ship, but I'm going to.
And we'll post an answer.
And we can post an answer to this definitely. It's a very good question, and it's actually one we have not run into. It'd be interesting to hear where that question is coming from if you have it, and what part of the country. But we have streetscape standards that even in by right development that the developer has to come in and meet, and that includes streetscape improvements and any associated infrastructure, including street trees and street furniture and what have you. So we have I'm not going to jump into rough proportionality, but we have had no issues here in what enabling legislation has allowed us to do along those lines. And we'll talk to Philip.
And as a person with very, I don't even play an attorney on TV. This is Jeff, but that's the kind of question, and you need to write a smart master plan and form-based code. That's the kind of question you have to consider to see if things are going to logically and economically happen. And if they're not, you need to recalibrate.
And the form-based code does not itself have any types of development standards necessarily in it, where you would reference back to, for example, if you have a unified development ordinance or any standards that exist there, you could reference back to those types of requirements. So it doesn't typically exist in the form-based code.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you going to say more?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. How difficult in your examples was it to persuade local government officials, i.e. the mayor, city manager, council, to consider form-based code instead of conventional zoning? And to that, what is the first step in considering form-based code?
The first step is people having the conversation somewhat about confronting change. It happens in different ways. My take as an outsider, as a consultant on Overland Park, and Jason can correct me on this, but was that a very conservative or kind of right-wing, in a good way, government and really locale really saw that if they didn't change things, they were kind of stuck, and that's a very, very well-run government, and the really big streets and roadways and everything, they're all really well done. They have all the great landscaping, but because of transportation and other kind of just technical issues about cities, they realized to grow more, they were going to have to change the ways they did some things. In Columbia Pike, and this is going back more than a decade, what happened was they had to the north of Columbia Pike and to the east, they had these rail corridors, transit corridors that by some stroke of good fortune and good sense they put underground, and they were very much in the habit of trading density and getting great development on them. They had, Columbia Pike was, I would say, kind of the poor side of town. Very interesting side of town, but nothing much was happening here. Columbia Pike, they hadn't really had development in about 30 or 40 years, with the exception of a drive-through bank. And they were trying to, they'd been doing a lot of planning, trying to see how can we help this part of our county. We're booming elsewhere. What should be our main street is really stuck. And through a lot of planning efforts, they decided sort of what they wanted to be when they grew up. And at some point, they figured out through, I guess, awareness that a form-based code might be the way to encourage development in an area where they didn't have the heavy rail transit. So they went through that process. And I would say that the final charrette in 2002 and the form-based code that went with it, that master planning process was really the icing on the cake of a lot of discussions with the citizens and the property owners that happened up to that point. So that's all I got.
I would say that's pretty typical of how you introduce the principles and kind of how there's a paradigm. I mentioned the paradigm shift earlier, and it's really getting past that psychological bit in someone's head and convincing them of what the benefits are of a form-based code and the principles embedded in it. Next question.
All right, great. This is an interesting angle. What is the role of the market in the success of form-based codes? Are they successful in hot markets? Where is the development demand? Where do you see the trends?
I'm not sure if this directly answers the question, but the market is the key. Profit is the key. It's that idea about the public sector sets up the rules and the private sector builds it. Understanding that market and setting things up so that it works for the private sector and the citizens is the key. We've written form-based codes both in places where the market is hot, and I would have to say Columbia Pike is one of those, despite the recession we I hope are climbing out of. We've also written codes in places where there is much less of a market, and I think the Heart of Peoria plan might be an example of that. And I would argue where you don't have a really strong market, it's even more important in those places not to waste what market you have. You want to try and push development in a good situation.
I think one of the keys to a good consulting team when they come in to work on a form-based code, and this was the case both in Overland Park and in Columbia Pike, is that you have a financial analyst or someone looking at those market conditions when the code is being drafted. When actually at the charrette, when you're starting to look at what are the size of the building envelopes that we can tolerate here. It's very unlikely in many instances that you're going to be able to go up to 12 stories, nor would you in a lot of areas. But so you really need to use that as a calibration for what and how much of a building envelope that you're going to mandate is key.
Yes.
Next. Question, please.
Okay. Do you feel form-based codes promote or hinder innovative design? Example, how does a Frank Gehry design cultural institution exist in this structure?
Look, two things. One, public buildings, we don't try and control the form of public buildings. They're the cherry on the cake or the icing on the cake. The special elements, and that's the way it had been through history, I guess, prior to the Second World War. But the second is on innovation on the design of private buildings, and I would say there that the building, the property, owner and the architect, the first duty in a private building is there's some things the building has to do to support the city it's in, the town it's in. It has a kind of civic duty to do some very basic, simple things. The idea of innovation, I would maybe hop on Google, and if you want to talk about innovation, most people involved in architecture have turned of the Catalonian architect Antonio Gaudí, G-A-U-D-I. If you look at the difference, look at his private buildings. He did a number of private apartment buildings which are incredibly innovative, yet they are urban fabric buildings. Look up Gaudí, Victor Horta, but basic point for public buildings, that's a place for those exceptional and more sculptural buildings, which is what Frank Gehry is all about.
And that was the case in Overland Park. In our regulating plan, we had a handful of buildings bolded in black, and not the historic structures, but some other ones that were actually community buildings that did not have to adhere to any type of requirement in the code. Next question.
Great. Are there examples of form-based codes that are more suburban? These examples appear to be more for downtowns.
I would say look at Overland Park, because Overland Park's downtown is a small downtown in the middle of a very suburban area. I would say, and look at also in the Peoria codes, those are for neighborhood centers and the warehouse district. So by its nature, when you're doing a form-based code, you're really talking about creating walkable urbanism, not drive, what I call, not really drivable, but drive compulsory suburbanism. It wouldn't really make sense to do. It would be remarkably strange to write a form-based code for spread out behind parking strip centers and things like that. But urban centers, main streets within suburbia, they're all examples of that.
What is unique about Overland Park is, although it's extremely suburban, it has the downtown. It has some good bones in the streets, developing the main part of a grid, which was one reason we chose it. It made it a little easier to then implement some of these building envelope standards because the street system did exist. But it was still a very suburban situation in that the more recent developments didn't have much of a semblance to those principles that we were trying to strive to achieve.
Okay. This will be our last question, and then we'll wrap up. I kind of saved this one for last. Let's talk about some money here. Can you talk more about administrative costs to administering and implementing this, any form-based code, or any of the examples that you gave, if you know any of the financial figures for that?
Let me just use Overland Park. We were fortunate in Overland Park. Shortly after the election of Obama, there were a number of funds available, and what we ended up doing was pursuing an energy efficiency and conservation block grant with the federal government to fund the development of our form-based code. There were 10 cities in each state that could receive funding, the 10 most populous cities in each state, and we chose to use the funds. Actually, Overland Park received $1.75 million from the government to do building retrofits for energy conservation, all the way to our form-based code. We did have to work with the EPA and keep them in the loop, but we received around $300,000 to develop that code. It was a 1.5 to 2 year process. So I think that's a good number to kind of consider in doing so, especially if you want to hire some of the best firms.
And I would have to, this is Jeff, I would jump in and point out maybe a little, not directly on the subject, but right beside it. When you're doing the master plan form-based code, what you're doing is a lot of the planning work up front. It's very front-loaded. The administration you get after that is the skids are very, very greased. You're really checking to see if someone fits in to your master plan and form-based code. You're not having the running fight that typically happens in areas with demand where you have a pitched battle about each and every project, figuring out what to do with it. So in that way, it's after adoption, it's much more efficient.
Yeah. Good point.
Great. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for today. For those that are still in attendance, I would like to remind you again to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast by visiting planning.org/CM. Again, this is available for 1.5 CM credits for current viewing only, but you can always see our webcast on our YouTube channel or grab a PDF of it. So this concludes today's session, and I'd like to thank the Maryland chapter for sponsoring this, and of course to our speakers, Jeff, Jason, and Philip. You guys are great. This was a wonderful overview, and I was getting a lot of comments in that everyone was so happy with the images. So well done, and everyone happy Friday, and we will see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.